Welcome back to Fast Market. I'm Alex Coffey alongside Kevin Hinks. It's now time for our cash tag segment. Joining us here in studios, TD Ameritrade Network contributor Jenny Horn from LikeFolio.com. The VP of Research, Megan Brantley, is with us as well. Always fun conversation here for us, Jenny. We're going to be talking the payment services space and Square and PayPal. And there's really no other industry, I think, getting disrupted more in real time than this particular space.
Yes, and I feel like we've had sort of a front seat to witness it. If you look at now the way that merchants are just accepting payments, you go to checkout online, which of course has been a huge way these companies have sort of risen to relevance over the last year. But also, if you've just been a tech investor over the last 5 years, you've been extremely rewarded by some of these names. So the NASDAQ composite, if you look at from September 2016 to now, has gained about 180%, but that is nothing compared to Square's near 2,100% gain and PayPal's near 700% gain. So both of these stocks have seen astronomical growth as we move into this more world of digital payments. Now, the compound annual growth rate for the global fintech market is estimated to grow at about 19% through 2028, according to Grand View Research. And we've seen both of these companies sort of taking a piece of the pie. Now, PayPal has sort of led the fintech industry since the 1990s, but despite its longevity, it actually looks like it could continue these very healthy levels of growth for the near-term future. So in addition to its Venmo service, which is its peer-to-peer payment service, it also has become more popular just with merchants who want a secure way to check out and also want to be more contactless. I think the way of us carrying around wallets is going to continue to disappear, and one day we'll just all be using our phones to pay for absolutely everything. But they also just bought Paydi, which is a Japanese buy now, pay later service, for about $2.7 billion. And Paydi is very important because it is the third largest e-commerce economy in the world. So that is no small deal. But what PayPal doesn't do is they do not offer traditional banking services. So that's where you sort of enter then Square. Square does now have an industrial bank. So that is important to keep in mind because that poses a serious threat to PayPal, even though Square is the newcomer and still much smaller. But Square has transformed itself really into a global player in this space. And I have to commend them for just how they've been able to compete with PayPal, again, a company that's been around since the early 1990s. But Square is actually, competing in this sort of peer-to-peer payment space. We're seeing its Cash App actually almost catching Venmo with about 70 million users compared to Venmo's 76 million users. So that is just, to me, a crazy growth story because there was a day about 2 years ago when these companies weren't quite yet competing in the same space. I think that day now is here. But one thing about both of these companies that they both share in common is they are now trading at pretty high valuations. These companies, for their levels of growth, they're not cheap. Now, you could argue that could be justified if you believe really in the transformation into e-payments, but their valuations are something that is of a concern to investors. And that is actually what our first tweeter today highlights, which highlights a more traditional bank compared to some of these new fintech players, which says, Goldman Sachs is now just too cheap to ignore, off 10% off all-time highs. 7 times earnings, 2 times sales, 2.2% yield, and a growth-focused CEO, $127 billion market cap, and $61 billion in revenues. Perspective, Square and PayPal, I love a small business and own smaller, 10 times more expensive. Yes, growing faster, but my God, are we paying up for that growth? So I just thought that was a very key point that right now we've sort of put these traditional banks and the financials by the wayside, but when looking at it from a trading perspective, the valuations are something to consider here. But our next tweeter today talks about this infamous buy now, pay later space, which I feel like we just can't stop talking about recently, which says, I think a firm could be the next Square or PayPal if they can pivot within their app to add other services. Regardless, large untapped potential with buy now, pay later. So, Megan, I am so curious your thoughts on buy now, pay later, because Affirm has been a company that I have used even prior to the company going public. It's actually very lethal if you shop too much like I do, but it's sort of disrupted this financial payment space.
Yeah, it is. I think that consumers really like this concept of buy now, pay later, especially because most of these services, there's no interest that they're tacking onto this. So that's a perceived advantage. And I think that both PayPal and Square are taking advantage of this. They realized how important this was to consumers. Square, with its acquisition of Afterpay, they plan to integrate these services within its seller and its Cash App ecosystem, which I think is really key. The crossover and functionality on the side of the consumer and also on the the side of the merchant. And then PayPal as well. Whenever you consider PayPal already has its pay in 4 service, but then with its acquisition that you noted, I think that this shows that it realizes that this is, this is definitely high priority for consumers. Just in general, our mentions of consumers using a buy now, pay later service are up more than 20% versus 2019. And I think that a lot of this too can be attributed to some type of normalization, because a lot of people may be using a buy now, pay later service like a firm, for example, whenever they're purchasing a Peloton and may not even realize it. It's just so popular of a financing option. And so I think that this is, definitely something to consider moving forward for both companies, but it's a good sign that they both realize that this is of priority for consumers.
Yeah, Megan, when you look at these two names, there's certainly a Home Depot and Lowe's relationship in terms of competing with these two names. But what Jenny Horn just put her finger on was that in many ways, like Cash App versus Venmo, it's one of those objects in the rearview mirror are closer than they appear. I mean, that 70 million versus 76 million is pretty close to equal in terms of that. So PayPal is clearly a bigger company, in business more, but Square is one of those hyperbolic growth companies, and now buy now, pay later is a wildfire taking over these businesses. So the question, though, is which is the better value? Which is the more popular name? The IBM of the payment space in terms of PayPal, or the high-flying, NVIDIA stock of payment, which is Square? Because Square started out with hardware, right? And giving you other ways. Now it's in so many things that aren't hardware, aren't brick and mortar. Is this stock destined to blow past PayPal in terms of popularity, Megan?
That's a really good question. It's almost like whenever we look at PayPal and Square, it's almost like a David and Goliath type story. Normally, we've been coming in and we've been talking about how Square, just from an innovation perspective, it's the first mover when it comes to developing these new services and expanding its platform. It was really ahead of this whole, ecosystem, this digital wallet ecosystem mindset. And PayPal's been playing a little bit of catch up. So it's weird to see the giant playing catch up to the innovator, right? So I think that if you're looking at it from an innovation standpoint, Square definitely has a lead. We do see this whenever it comes to overall happiness as well. We see Square's overall happiness a little bit higher versus PayPal's. We see Cash App's overall consumer happiness a little bit higher versus Venmo's. However, we are starting to see some traction when it comes to PayPal starting to be able to close that gap a little bit. We see some traction with its new Venmo redesign and expanded offerings inside of its Venmo ecosystem. So we're starting to see that move the needle a little bit for Venmo. But important to note that from a happiness perspective, Square is still leading the way.
So, Megan, I was curious about your digital wallet mentions, which I saw are up almost 200% on a 2-year basis, which is ridiculous. And so I'm curious then, I know that we're talking specifically Square and PayPal today, but how does Apple Pay fit into that? Because I do have to say that a lot of us have iPhones. We talk about this ecosystem. So naturally, I do use Apple Pay because it's already on my phone. So I have to think that does give some sort of competition to both Square and PayPal.
It does, and I think that that's a really big testament as to how well Square and PayPal have been able to innovate, because you would think that Apple would have this huge advantage because their phone and their devices are in the hands of consumers everywhere. However, we're not really seeing this translate in terms to growth at the same rate that we've seen the Cash Apps and the Venmos of the world. So I think that, Apple is playing a little bit of catch up. I believe Apple is trying to develop some type of a buy now, pay later service as well. But it's interesting to see, and I think encouraging if you are a Square or PayPal investor, that these companies are able to innovate ahead of even Apple, who is an extreme innovator in and of itself. But so far, whenever we're looking at those wallet mentions, we do see PayPal and Square both with an advantage over Apple's Apple Wallet.
Megan, kind of an interesting question, I think, that hopefully you'll have some insight here because you're looking at how people are talking about these companies. I know they're often pitted as rivals versus each other, and fair enough. I think in the short term that is true. They're trying to gain market share. But in the medium to long term, is it almost safe to say that they're kind of one side of the financial services industry versus sort of the traditional banking system and trying to disrupt it? Aren't in many ways their competitors, the JP Morgan Chases, the Bank of Americas, the Wells Fargos of the world, if they ultimately do what they're trying to do?
Yeah, I think that they're trying to be kind of a layer on top of this. They're trying to facilitate and aggregate all the these different services. And so you see things like direct deposit. You see things that people are able to, send money, these peer-to-peer transactions and things like this, these service layers on top of what a traditional bank would offer. So I'm not sure that they're trying to be, especially PayPal. I'm not sure PayPal necessarily wants to be a direct competition with the bank. However, I think that they are, creating a better environment for consumers who are trying to keep all of their transactions in one location and also execute those digitally.
Megan, as we wrap this segment here, I just want to kind of get your final thoughts. When you do look at these companies together, do you like them both? Do you like one more than the other? Because it seems as though PayPal gets more buzz and it's growing faster. So when I see that, I have to think that in many ways Goliath is winning.
Yeah, I think that whenever we look at these, although earnings isn't tomorrow, we still went ahead and looked at these scores. What would it be? I think that PayPal is at a 14 and Square is at an 8. So both of those are, I would say, fairly neutral, however, trending in the positive direction. And you can see that PayPal has just a little bit of an edge, partially because of those improvements in happiness that we're starting to see come through, and also because there is a slight mention, just buzz growth edge that we're recording just of near term. So definitely something to watch, but both of them very, very close whenever comparatively when it comes to just neutral trending a slightly positive.
Good stuff, and I'm sure we'll check in again around those earnings dates as well. Megan Brantley, thanks as always for joining us, the VP of Research at LikeFolio.com.